Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Hipster Podcast. This is your host, Jamil Hassan, the Crypto Hipster, where I interview founders, entrepreneurs, executives, thought leaders, you name it, all over the world, crypto and blockchain. And today I have an amazing guest. At least he has one heck of a pedigree. So I'm really interested in talking to him. He is the co-founder, CEO of Cubist. His name is Riad Wahby. Riad, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jamil. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. So let's kick things off. Let's ask you first about your background. What is your background? And is it a logical background for what you're doing now?
That's a great question. I'm not sure is the short answer, but I'll let you decide. So actually, I started out in something really completely different than blockchain or anything like this. I used to be an electrical engineer. I was a circuit designer. I was building chips for like telephony. And spent a long time doing that. And then at some point, I became friends with somebody who's sort of a computer science professor. He was at UT Austin at the time. Now he's at NYU. His name is Mike Wallfish. He's a fantastic guy. And he convinced me, like, quit your job in EE and become a computer scientist. And somehow that worked, which is just completely, like, I look back on it and I'm like, I don't know if I could ever do that, to like tell somebody like, you know what, you got a job, but who cares? Quit, go become a computer scientist. So I did. I started working on, ZK proofs. And I mean, kind of before they were useful at all in the blockchain space. This was a little over 10 years ago. Was working on, all kinds of, like, trying to make things more practical, trying to, figure out where are we going to use these things. And so then, eventually I was a grad student. I was working with Dan Bonnet at Stanford. He's kind of involved in everything Web3 related, of course. And so we worked on all kinds of interesting stuff. We worked on, stuff like anonymous airdrops and rollups and you name it. We helped write the standard for the signature scheme that's now used in the Ethereum beacon chain. So we kind of did a little bit of everything. And then, at the end of grad school, we started to think, my co-founders and I started to think about how we take some of this research that we'd been doing. My co-founders, two of my co-founders were actually also PhD students at Stanford with me. We were thinking about, like, what do we do? How do we bring some of this stuff to, the rest of Web3, like working kind of down in the guts? You help a little bit, but not quite as much as we wanted to, right? Like, we wanted to actually talk to teams and figure out what their pain points were and all of this. And we were fortunate to be joined by our fourth co-founder, Anne, who is our business mind, who, like, actually sort of turned us from folks thinking about, like, weird technical problems that sounded like fun to folks thinking about weird technical problems that not only sounded like fun, but were actually useful to somebody. So thanks to Anne.
Awesome. Thank you, man. So hopefully she listens to this. So Cubist, what are you all about? And what are the benefits of Cube Signer?
Yeah, so Cubist, we build key management infrastructure. That's Cube Signer. And so the basically, let me try and illustrate by way of a couple horror stories that we heard from really early folks that we were talking to. We heard from one person, when we were a small dev shop, there were just two of us. We were sitting around, maybe in the same room even, and we had, a few keys. It was fine. We had some ledgers. It was okay. We could just kind of manage the keys for our, whatever it was, for our DeFi app or whatever that way. And then, we spread to more chains and we had more developers. And eventually there was just one person who had a laptop and all the keys were on that laptop. And I mean, literally somebody told us, like, we were afraid that this person was going to get hit by a bus, which, I mean, yeah, makes sense. We had another person who was the laptop person, and they left the company and only 6 months later realized they still had all the keys. So it's like, oh my God, this is a disaster, right? So we started to think about this, like, how do you do this systematically? How do you make sure that the right people have access to the keys, that, you're generating the keys in a secure way, that they're being stored securely, that you have sort of all kinds of, like, disaster recovery, that you have API access to your keys, that you can actually program against them. And then on top of that, super high speed, great performance, and the ability to do things like set a policy on a key. Like, I know that this key is only being used for a particular trading strategy. So if somebody tries to make a trade that looks like it's pretty far outside that trading strategy, I want something to just say no. Like I don't want it to be able to, right? I don't want somebody to just like, oh, now my trading strategy is give all the money to the hackers. Well, okay. So you want to avoid that sort of thing. So this is really what CubeSigner is all about. It's a system that lets you do all of these things. All the keys are stored inside of secure hardware. There's this policy engine that gives you this rich ability to, or this ability to express these rich policies. And everything is sort of API programmatic. So anything you could do with the system, you could do through the API. And you know, this gives you like all these kind of interesting powers.
I have a horror story. I haven't shared it yet on the podcast, but maybe this is a good opportunity to do that.
Yeah, share. I'm listening. I'm here for you.
I had a wallet. I had it for 8 years, 7 years, since 2017. I used it, worked all the time. It's perfect. I stored some cryptos in there. And then recently there was a note that one of the cryptos is being merged. So I said, okay, this is a good time for me to get it out and sell it. So I put some Ethereum, which I never held Ethereum in it because if you don't have any Ethereum, people can't send tokens. I put some Ethereum in it. And I said, okay, I tried it. I went to the App Store and Google and Apple had deleted the app. And then I bought a what do you call it? The Samsung, and said, okay, maybe I'll try to get in that way. And that app was gone. And then I said, okay, my money's frozen. So I filed a police report, and the cop was like, okay, oh no, this site, because the original site is called Edu. And it was, no, this is like Edu wallet. Put your keys in there. I said, okay, let me first try to create a wallet. So I took it and tried to create other wallets from different apps, and it didn't recognize the seed phrase. So the seed phrase always worked. Now it doesn't work. I put it in the Edu wallet site, and the next minute I can't get in, but the next few minutes later, all my crypto was sent out. So, total market value 12,000, total cost basis 40,000. It's going to be a good tax number for my future. But how do you stop things like that? Like, I thought it was decentralized all along, and it was centralized all along. How can you? And it's still a problem. How can you help other people with that problem where they might think it's decentralized, but it's not really?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. I mean, this is like, that's a good one. If it's okay with you, I'm going to remember that one and maybe tell it anonymized to some folks. But no, this is exactly the kind of thing that you tend to see, right? Because like fundamentally, like your access to the chain is mediated by your like these keys, right? You have some signing keys, you have your wallet, and if that's gone, your access is gone, right? Your funds are gone, and obviously that creates this huge incentive for people to try and scam their way into your wallets. And this is what you've just described. Sounds like kind of the classic example of you were using this piece of software, probably the folks who were running that app, like I don't know, they ran out of money and they gave up, and then like their domain went away and next thing you know, somebody buys it up, makes it look pretty, and now they're just like collecting money. Yeah, absolutely, this kind of thing happens all the time. And so I think the really important thing for people is it like to be able to use crypto is to be able to like give them something that's as reliable and as natural to use as Gmail or whatever, right? Like you have a Gmail account, you log into the Gmail account, like if you forget about it, okay, fine, maybe in 18 months Google sends you an email saying, hey, if you don't log in, we're going to delete it. But like you log in, it's like everything's still there, everything you remember it, right? So like we need these kind of facilities for people. I mean, look, of course, the other way to go is, you put your seed phrase on a metal plate and bury it in your backyard, but that's only good for, 1% at best of the space. That's not everyday people. My dad's not going to do that, right? I mean, he'd make fun of me for doing it, right? So I think like bridging this gap is all about like bringing the functionality to the users, like where they are, and like helping them to like interact with the computer in the same way that they always did, but now they get all these extra powers. Like, oh, good, you can interact with Web3. You don't have to be this sort of bleeding edge diehard. You don't have to like learn 10 pages of terminology and like pour through forums and whatever just to sort of get started, which I think kind of is where we still are, unfortunately.
Yeah, if it can happen to me, it can happen to many, many, many people.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to find out, your outlook on blockchain security. Why is it important, and what are the more critically important recent advancements?
So I think there are a bunch, yeah, there's a bunch of really interesting stuff going on. So one that we've seen that's like kind of huge is this. Okay, this is slightly older now, but to me, this is a great example of exactly the kind of thing, and is very related to your story. Um, there's this notion in computer security generally of supply chain security, right? And the supply chain here could mean physical goods being delivered, but it could also mean the software that you're using, right? Like when you start up an application, it relies on some remote server. That application is built from a bunch of libraries that other people have written, perhaps, in an open source case, for example. And so all of those are opportunities for something to go wrong, right? And so in the case that you're describing, basically your supply chain included this wallet's website, which, well, okay, it was compromised. But we've seen other interesting examples of this. So there was a software supply chain vulnerability that actually affected like last year, I think, that affected Ledger users, where they okay, my recollection is dim here, but my recollection is that basically there was a sort of a bad update to the app that got pushed, or maybe it was like a connector library that people, I think it was a connector library that people were using to like use their ledger through a website or something like this. Worth double checking me, but roughly that. The story's the same, regardless of the details. But the point is, there was just this like tiny little piece of software that you need it for functionality, but if somebody modifies it, now suddenly all bets are off, and people actually had their wallets drained because of this, right? So there's a bunch of pieces, and any of these things can be the weak link, right? You've got your ledger, or you've got your virtual private HSM in the cloud, which is the way we think about CubeSigner, and that is like this very, very strong guarantee of your keys are safe. And then you have to make sure on top of that whatever software you're using to connect to it, that's also secure. You have to make sure that if somebody installs malware on your computer, maybe they can drain your, right? So to me, like as an end user of this space, like even understanding what the software supply chains look like is already this huge, really difficult task, right? And so to me, that's like from a consumer perspective, that's number one, is like, how can I keep myself safe? How do I like have the same level of trust in the the applications that I'm using as I do in Gmail or whatever, right? Because I think if you look at sort of normal people day to day, not sort of crypto diehards, um, if you think about it, like their Gmail account is like sort of the keys to the kingdom, right? Like you can reset all the passwords, you can get access to the banks, whatever, right? So everyone has that already. But the interesting thing here is Google has done an extremely good job of locking these things down, of detecting when something is going wrong, right? So there's all this kind of infrastructure that's basically invisible, right? That's happening behind the scenes. I don't see it normally, unless maybe I try to log into my Gmail account from a different country and I get a text saying, "Hey, did you try to do this?" Right? So there it's like, oh, somebody really is watching, right? But that kind of protection, I think, is basically where we need to get. And so this is actually one of the things that we're really thinking about hard with CubeSigner, is like, how do we bring you that same level of protection? And so one of the folks that we're working with really closely is Avalabs. Our CubeSigner is actually the infrastructure behind the Avalanche core wallet. So if you download core wallet and you say log in with Google, basically that's making you this virtual private HSM. It lives in the cloud. You can access it from any of your devices. You don't have to worry about things like manually copying around your passphrase, or sorry, your seed phrase or whatever. But if you decide later, I want to go use a different system, I want to use a ledger or whatever, sure, you can get that seed phrase out. You can use it in your ledger. You don't have to use our system at all, right? So we're not here to trap you. We're just here to help you. And you get basically these same kinds of protections because you're actually literally logging in using the Google flow, which means when Google notices something seems odd here, then you're going to get an alert, or you're going to, or they're going to say no or whatever. And then on top of that, you can add things like, if you've got a YubiKey, or you've got, Google Authenticator on your phone or whatever it is, you can actually add that on top to sort of give yourself additional protection. So I think in this way, we're really trying to sort of raise the floor of protection for everyone, and simultaneously to give people the ability to protect themselves even more, right? Because, if I'm just a gamer, I'm just, I've got like $5 worth of worth of crypto in a game, like, okay, it probably doesn't make sense for me to have like, 10 hardware tokens and like a 30-minute timeout before I can do anything, because it's like, okay, fine, then I can't play my game. I've just like ruined my day, right? But if I'm like really trying to transfer serious value, it makes sense to have that available.
It sure does. Makes a lot of sense to me. So in addition to my story, there have been a few events, right, that have led up to the increased Web3 security measures compared to a few years ago, right? I'm thinking the first event was FTX, right? And then there were others, like you mentioned, Ledger, right? What were some of the key events, that led up to the security measures?
So I think one that we've seen is one like trend that we've seen is that I'd say we can kind of separate these into two categories. One is like kind of squarely computer security. Like, did somebody break into my machine effectively and steal my stuff, right? And the other one is kind of like, how do I know who I'm dealing with? Like, it could be that like no one's stealing my keys, no one's stealing my tokens, but the tokens are themselves a scam, right? Like, so that one kind of tends to sound more like the FTX situation. And I think these actually end up being kind of a little bit different in how we deal with them, right? So like rugs and stuff like this, I mean, fundamentally in the sort of decentralized Web3 universe, the best we have really is sort of reputation, right? If I know that somebody is has a good reputation, if I can make sure that they're interacting with safe tokens, or whatever it is, like that gives me a higher level of assurance, right? And by the way, it's not perfect, of course, because like FTX had a great reputation, right? So it's always possible for good people to turn bad, or for bad people to have been hiding out in good clothes for a long time. So but that sort of thing, I mean, there's not a lot of technical measures to take there other than making sure that people have access to that information. So you can think about this as building up like an information infrastructure where it should be easy for a new person in the space to come in and just figure out, like, what, this token's probably a scam. This token's not. Because like the last thing we want is new retail user comes in, first experience that they have is I got scammed for $100, right? And it's like, okay, for a lot of people that $100 isn't going to be make or break. For some people it will be, but for a lot of people, like, okay, they risked $100, they lost $100, but it leaves a sour taste in their mouth, right? And that's a person that's going to be resistant next time. That's a person that's sort of hurting the goal of like actually getting real Web3 adoption now. So I think kind of thinking through this information infrastructure to help people figure out what's good, or at least figure out what's bad, is really, really important. And then on the other side, I think we've seen a lot of sort of ad hoc computer security measures that kind of worked for a while, but the adversary nowadays is very powerful, right? Like, who is it that's actually trying to steal crypto in bulk? Well, what we know is that there are a bunch of governments that are trying to do this because that's how they fund whatever illegal weapons programs, right? And well, that's a serious adversary, right? They have government level resources to throw at stealing stuff, right? And probably they're not going to like break into my wallet and steal $100, but they're certainly going to try and like take over a bridge and steal a $500 million, right? So that's the sort of thing where like really understanding like this is actually the risk profile that we face in Web3 is government level adversaries trying to steal money on a grand scale. And like, what do we do against that? So I think we've seen in the past some kinds of security measures that were already known to be antiquated, but were kind of good enough, right? So like a classic example of this, I think, last year, I think last year there was a bunch of folks who were using Friendtech, got their wallets drained, and it turned out to be a classic thing, right? It turned out to be the that like SMS resets, like somebody basically hijacks your SIM and then like they're able to receive SMSs and the SMS was being used for authentication. Well, I mean, don't use that. Never, ever, ever use that, right? And so I think, what ended up happening was, well, Friendtech's wallet provider had that as kind of the best option. And so that's what Friend.tech went with. And so that's what happened to their users, right? And I think there's a couple different things that happen there. One is this was a case where, as usual, you have to make a decision between, am I going to give my users, a really nice UX, or am I going to kind of bug them and be a pain to get them to use better security? And I think a lot of folks really think that that's kind of this iron trade-off, right? That you can't get both. And I think, unfortunately, what we see is that with a lot of like wallet providers, that's kind of true, right? So like, as I said, like Friend.tech's wallet provider, and by the way, I actually, I'm good friends with Henry at Privy. I like him a lot. We were at Stanford at the same time. I know him really well. He's a super sharp guy. I love him a lot. But I think this was this was kind of an unfortunate thing where this was the best option, and so this is what the customer went with, and so the result was that people lost money. And I think as like providers of this kind of service, like we have an obligation to not only like encourage our customers to use the right tech, to use the right approaches, but also we have an obligation to make the user experience when you do so good. Because if we don't, again, this is like person comes in the door, person turns around and leaves again, because they come into the crypto space, they see, this is a pain. I got to write down 24 words. I need to go buy a YubiKey or a ledger. Like suddenly, like, this isn't for me. I'm gonna go do something else, right? They'll go back to, I don't know, sports betting or something, right? So, seriously, right? I think a lot of people use them equivalently. So to me, this is like in both cases, we need to start from the user, start from what is it that my dad would see if he were trying to invest in a new meme coin, right? And how would he figure out this is a good one? How would he like protect his login identity? Like all of these things, like once we can start actually like giving serious answers to those questions, when we can look at with a straight face at one another and say, we're actually doing a pretty good job, we're really trying to get the users like empowered here, I think that's when we can say like, okay, we're doing pretty well in terms of security.
Yeah, I won't even touch meme coins. So, no, now I'm just like, let me hold some basic blue chippers and wait, So,
yeah,
but there is there's this other thing out there people use, it's called staking, So I want to find out, the current state of staking, and how is the Secure Staking Alliance further enhancing this infrastructure, including what's your level of work with and partnership collaboration with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I think staking is like fascinating for a bunch of different reasons. Like on a technological level, it's, first of all, it's like mind blowing that Ethereum managed to switch itself over, right? And we're still like 2 years out. It's still like, oh my gosh, that's amazing. That's like such a technical feat. Like people will be looking back at that in 50 years and saying like, that's a seriously impressive technical feat. But I think beyond that, like, I think there are a lot of interesting opportunities here to think about what does the information infrastructure look like for people who want to stake. So if you think about let's just take Ethereum staking, and there's plenty of other things that one can stake, but as a starting point, right? So if I stake with with one of the big providers, or if I go with a liquid staking token, whatever it is, the notion, like the sales pitch is, this is essentially risk-free, right? This is essentially risk-free yield. Is that true? Well, I mean, historically, it's been very low risk compared to everything else in the space. Yes, absolutely, amazingly low risk. But there are actually real technical risks associated with staking. So even just in the case of Ethereum staking, if we look back at the history of slashings on Ethereum, there haven't been very many slashings on mainnet. Like by total value stake, tiny, tiny, tiny fraction, which is great. But there is always this question, like, okay, but what is the actual like danger level of of slashing for a given protocol, right? Like if I decide I'm going to deposit into Lido, I'm basically taking on whatever technical risk Lido has, because if a bad enough thing happens and Lido gets like super duper slashed, well, okay, fine. Lido is so big that if they get super duper slashed, the whole chain's in trouble. But I'm thinking about myself here. Like if they get super duper slashed, then like now that, I mean, it turns out it wasn't so low risk for me after all, right? And so if we look back at the history of like how they're operating, well, they do a really good job actually. Like they're very careful about making sure that they have a variety of different providers, that those providers are taking very different approaches to things. You know, we've talked extensively with those folks. They know what they're doing. They're really sharp. But still, even there, we've seen cases where things have gone a little bit wrong, and only a little bit, which is good, but it's enough to show like, okay, things could go more wrong maybe. So we've seen folks, you know, there's been like, oh, I don't know, like a data center migration that went wrong and a few hundred validators got slashed. Or there was one scary case where nobody got slashed, but it turned out that one of the operators was sort of accidentally exposing all their secret key material to the internet for a few months. And fortunately, nobody, as far as we can tell, nobody stole it, and Lido made them exit the validators and no money was lost. Great. But this is the sort of thing that like there, but for the grace of God, right? Like just a little bit differently, and things could have been like 10,000 validators getting slashed is no joke, right? So this is the sort of thing where we like taking a step back, like how do we think about improving the overall level of security? So that means on the one hand, things like just like helping people to learn about different providers and their level of competence and the level of care that they put in, because there is a danger, of course, of like a race to the bottom, right? The bad thing is like you get great yield from this provider, but also they're taking a huge risk, and like, and the difference in yield probably wasn't worth it, right? So, and then on the other hand, like, how do we help providers to do better? Like, how do we help providers to do a better job of, of setting up their infrastructure, of, of like running the machines, of being safe, being secure? And so that's really what Secure Staking Alliance is about. It's about getting a bunch of different people in the same room. So we've got folks who are, doing security audits. We've got folks who sell insurance. We've got folks who run, big validator protocols. We've got folks who are, working, with EigenLayer and building AVSs. We've got, folks like us who are building infrastructure. And all of these people sort of in the same room, kind of having a conversation about what should best practices look like? What are you doing that I'm not doing? How can I like start to be, better about these sorts of things, right? So that to me is like, how do we like basically push the industry forward? And I think on the sort of on the provider side, that's, this sort of loose consortium of, minds in a room. I think that's kind of the right way to go, because the alternative, as far as I can tell, is some kind of, heavy-handed governance structure. And I think we don't want that. Like we want the decentralized world, right? So getting people to kind of agree to this, to do it voluntarily is super important. And then on the other side, like providing that information to people, like, this provider is actually following these guidelines that, a bunch of people have signed off on as being sort of a good idea. Or maybe this other provider is not following these guidelines, right? Getting that kind of information to the end user, the person who's actually making the decision to push the button and send the money. That's super, super, super important. And then I think the other thing that we can do here, and I promise, I know I'm being long-winded, but I promise, I hope that this is interesting. The other thing that we can do is actually come up with new technical measures that reduce risk. So with CubeSigner, actually our very first customers were Ethereum. We're running Ethereum LSTs. We've got, few Ethereum LSTs that use our service still to like basically to manage all the keys, all the validator keys. And I think the big reason that they love this service for that is, you remember I talked about this policy layer that lets you say, this key can only be used in a certain way. Well, the policy layer is actually powerful enough to express the Ethereum slashing condition. So basically the key, you can think about it this way, the key basically remembers everything that it's ever signed. And if you ask it to sign something that would be slashable, it says, no, that one's slashable. I'm not gonna do that. And it tells you like this is slashable for this reason. And so the interesting thing about that is now you actually reduce the probability that you make mistakes, right? So like, even if you mess up your infrastructure, even if somebody gets into your infrastructure who's like malicious and is trying to slash you intentionally, you can't turn off that policy. You can't bypass it. So you're very, very strongly protected. We actually run thousands of validators on testnet mostly, but we run these and we do everything that you should not do. We like run multiple clients, we all this kind of bad stuff that would immediately get you slashed. But of course, the point is we're testing out our own stuff, and we've been running for months. We've got like top performance on the testnet, and we're cruising along with thousands of validators with no slashings. So. Okay, so I think this is the kind of direction that we need to go. And one last thought, I promise. We're actually entering an even more complicated universe now, right? It was already complex enough when we were talking about Ethereum staking, but now we're talking about eigenlayer. We're talking about a bunch of different AVSs. We're talking about Babylon with all the complexity of Bitcoin. We're talking about like now this kind of explosion of protocols, different places that you could decide to put to invest. And different levels of risk. And it's really hard, even harder to evaluate the risk of these things. Like, well, what does this AVS slashing condition mean for my risk as an investor? What is, the use of Bitcoin in Babylon with, some protocol? What does that mean for my risk? These are great questions. And we're still kind of shaking them out as an industry. The fact is, like, for a lot of these things, there are still a lot of unknown unknowns, right? So taking measures to sort of reduce that as much as possible, to put safety, to put safeguards in place, to, sort of get all of that into the sunlight so that people can actually look at it and examine it and find problems. I think these are super, super, super important things to do in the future.
Got it. So I want to make sure that I can summarize what you said to me, and that's basically how the best way to reduce theft and attacks going forward in the future is to stress test them now. And cover all that stuff so they don't happen in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So stress testing, super important. Just getting people in the same room, super important. Making sure that all that information is out there for other people to see, super important.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, awesome. So and what you said, it wasn't long-winded, it was very interesting, so thank you. I'm good with everything you said, so I would appreciate it. I appreciate your time and appreciate you explaining it to me. I love talking to you today. And I have one last question, and it's probably the easiest one to ask you is this: is how can people find out more information about you, about Cubist? How can they become customers or clients? How can they start to use your platform? How can they do any of that?
Absolutely. So cubist.dev is our website. You can send us an email, hello@cubist.dev. Yeah, you can ping me on Telegram. I'm Quantum, but spelled very strangely. It's KWANTAM. I'll give it to you later. You can put it somewhere. Yeah, I mean, but seriously, like hello@cubist.dev is a great way to just like get in touch, and happy to talk from there. Our website is cubist.dev. And I think on Twitter, we're cubistdev, all one word. So
Awesome. Thank you very much for your time today.
Jamal, thank you so much. It's been super fun.